Welcome to another 88K model railroad video, and in this video we're going to be installing Rocrail on a Pi Sprog 3 version 2 board. That board is attached to a Raspberry Pi 4 Model B, and the assumption is the Raspberry Pi has the Pi OS installed already. There's no need in us replicating that procedure, as the Raspberry Pi.org has the process refined and all the tools are there, so there's no need in replicating that in this video. But we're going to go through the installation process. We're going to configure the Raspberry Pi 4, we're going to install Rocrail, set up Rocrail, and then test run a loco. I mentioned, or maybe I didn't mention, but the Raspberry Pi 4 and 3, there's an issue with the serial port. The default configuration of the serial port with the Raspberry Pi 3 is different than the 4. When you try to mate and install the Pi Sprog, the unit, although the serial port shows that it's active, the problem is they're not aligned. And what I mean aligned is the Raspberry Pi Sprog is looking at one serial port as the connection, and the Raspberry Pi is looking at a different one, and that particular port is the difference between the serial, or what is it, the TTY S0 versus the TTY AMA0. That's where the conflict is, and we're going to address that. So let's get started. So let's get some of the basics out of the way, or get a basic understanding of what the issue is with the Pi Sprog and the Raspberry Pi 4. And the best way to see that is to make the comparison with the Digitrax system. The old interface used what they call the PR3. The PR3 was kind of the transport or the conduit between the computer and the command station. With facing the computer, there was a USB connection. Facing the command station was a local net connection, and that PR3 would pass information back and forth. Later on, Digitrax integrated the USB connection into the command station. That eliminated the need for the PR3, and you could see the or not the COM port, but the USB port. You can see it right here. Now with the Pi 3 or Pi 4 and the Pi Sprog, this USB cable is eliminated because the Pi Sprog is a hat, which is called hardware on top. It's connected directly to the Raspberry Pi, and the pins are now this USB connection. And we've got to configure those pins in order for it to communicate, or be able to communicate back and forth with the Pi Sprog and the Raspberry Pi. And that's the problem that a lot of guys are running into, and why they can't bring the Raspberry 4 up. Now the Raspberry 3, it comes up readily because it's using serial port 0, whereas the Pi 4 is using the AMA0 serial port. And if you don't configure and tell which Pi to use, to tell the Pi which port to use, then the Pi is going to be looking on one port, and the Pi Sprog is going to be looking on another port, and it's never going to sync up. It will look like it's synced up, but it will never communicate. So we're going to go through, bring everything up in the Raspberry Pi. We're going to look at it, install the Rocrail, and then I'll show you where the breakdown occurs. And then after that, we're going to go and we're going to resolve that issue and then bring that up. So let's swing over to the computer now. Here we are at the computer. I'm actually using the VNC to connect in via the Wi-Fi. So the Raspberry Pi 4 is connected to the Wi-Fi. Then I'm using the VNC to connect in so we can watch, or I can do the screen capture and we can see the installation process. First thing you want to do is shut down this Bluetooth connection. The Bluetooth uses the UART's port as well, and you don't want to create any type of conflicts or potential conflicts, as they can cause you to run down, like I always say, a rabbit hole. And especially with the Raspberry Pi, you can burn up a lot of time chasing your tail trying to get the system up. So once we shut the Bluetooth off, we need to configure the serial ports. Okay, so now the first thing what we're going to do is go into super user do, and we're going to go raspi-config. And that's going to bring up the interface. Now we're going to go into the interface option, and we're going to go down to the serial port. So we don't want the login shell to access the serial port because that will tie it up. Then we're going to enable but we want the serial port hardware to be enabled. So now you can see it says the shell, login shell, is disabled and the serial interface is enabled. So we can go in and finish this connection, or this option rather. And it's going to say, do we want to reboot? And we'll say yes, reboot.